to go through the biggest of hurricanes, and we now blow away. Not blowing away. We have faced adversity before, and we have always found our footing. The question before us now is whether our institutions rose to the moment and whether the budget really reflects that urgency. Madam Speaker, we are now past the relief stage and into rebuilding. I note the Prime Minister's announcement of the establishment of the National Reconstruction and Resilience Authority, NARA. But NARA is still without a legal foundation. No legislation has been brought to Parliament to formally establish it. And the public still doesn't have a clear picture of how it will operate and when it will become functional. Similarly, I would say in light of the destruction in the West and the rest of the island, the $10 billion roof grant program, while important, is simply not enough to meet the needs that exist. Hurricane Melissa devastated Westmoreland, St. Elizabeth, huge parts of St. James, Hanover, and Trelawney, but also affected other parishes, St. Anne, Clarendon, Manchester, and others, who experienced significant damage. Almost 5 months since Melissa, there are still hundreds of Jamaicans who go to sleep with no proper shelter. What is the plan for them? Madam Speaker, now let me turn to the estimates of expenditure. And I would want to start with something simple. A budget is a government's clearest statement of its priorities. So when I listened to the minister's presentation, it did not address the scale of the disaster we face. It read like a budget being business as usual, which cannot be right when there are thousands of Jamaicans who lost their homes, their businesses, farms, livestock, and everything that they work for. I want to turn to look at the revenue measures announced by the government. And I particularly, before I get into the economics, I want to start with the people, because that is where the conversation belongs. There is Miss Margaret in Sablamar, who lost her entire shop in Melissa. She has been borrowing to restock, but she's not back to where she started. There is James in Montego Bay who runs a small transport business. His vehicle was damaged. He's still paying to fix it, but he's not yet back on his feet. Madam Speaker, there are hundreds more who were affected by the hurricane who are not back to where they were before. They will now pay more on their grocery bills when they go to the supermarket, because the government has chosen to impose a new tax package of $18 billion. Madam Speaker, increasing the burden on ordinary Jamaicans, average Jamaicans, through higher taxes is not the right call at this time. And we on this side do not support it. If we were at the wicket, we would have played a different shot. When an economy is contracting, meaning it is slowing down, raising taxes is a pro-cyclical response. What that means in practice is that you are applying pressure in the same direction as the problem rather than against it. The economy is already shrinking. The tax base has weakened, first by 10 years of low growth under this administration, and then by the hurricane. Businesses are earning less, households are spending less, and the government's chosen response is to extract more revenue from an already financially stressed population. That does not sustainably address the fiscal challenge. You are compounding the economic problem. The more appropriate response in these circumstances is what is termed counter-cyclical. And what does that mean? You push against the slowdown in the economy. You stimulate activity and create the conditions for the tax base to recover organically. A growing economy generates more revenue over time than any package of new taxes that are imposed on the people who are already struggling to stay afloat after the hurricane. And beyond the timing, Madam Speaker, there's a real question of who carries the burden of these tax packages. The measures which were announced by the minister all fall disproportionately on those with lower incomes, including the elderly, the very people who are still struggling to recover from Melissa. Madam Speaker, I want to address the 10 billion levy on sugary drinks specifically, because the government has justified it as a public health measure. And that justification deserves examination. And let me say from the outset, we share the concern about the impact of sugar on the population and how that is impacting our healthcare system. The level of sugar consumption is a genuine concern and deserves serious policy attention. However, where we part with the government is what is being prescribed as the solution to that problem. If the primary concern is about reducing sugar outcomes, the government has more effective tools that can be used to do so. The government can mandate local manufacturers and importers to reformulate their products so that sugar content is reduced in those products, and provide a time frame by which those manufacturers and importers do so, because it will obviously require some time to reformulate their what they produce. This would reduce the amount of sugar people consume, and the government can do that. Now, I want to look at the assumptions behind this tax. The government is imposing the taxes on an assumption that there will be no reduction in the consumption of these drinks. Right. Yeah. The government anticipates to get $10 billion from consumption alone, which means that they do not believe that there will be health benefits from this new tax. Because if there was, there would be a reduction in consumption. And the reality that we find, Madam Speaker, is that the persons who consume these drinks do so not because they're not concerned about the sugar content, but the reality is that the alternatives are outside of their reach, whether it be natural juices, coconut water, or other things. So many of them are doing it not because they have a choice, but quite frankly, given their disposable income, they do not have a choice. All right? And without providing options which are healthy at a reasonable cost, all this tax will do is add a financial burden to those persons, many of whom are at the lowest end of the economic ladder. So, Madam Speaker, we do not believe this measure, apart from raising revenues, will have any desired impact on reducing consumption and increasing the health outcomes. The government also has other options. The government is one of the largest providers through the school feeding program to children. The government needs to ensure that what it provides meets the adequate and proper nutritional content for students. Many of the, whether it's the cherry malt or the bulla or what is provided, is not consistent with reducing sugar. So if we want to meet the health outcomes, let us start as government with how we formulate the products that are sent to our schools. And we would have the desired outcome of reducing sugar in the level of sugar that is consumed. I want to turn to the environmental levy. The name of the tax suggests that the cash flows from it will be directed towards environmental production, towards protecting our coastlines, our watersheds, our forests, the very natural infrastructure that Melissa reminded us we cannot afford to neglect. But the money goes straight into the consolidated fund. None of it is ring-fenced for specific environmental purposes. So we have a levy collecting money in the name of the environment, but it is not dedicated to the protection of the environment. It's simply another revenue source. And as with the sugary drinks tax,
Tai Chi walking is more than just a workout. It's a fresh start for menopausal women. We start this Monday.
Ladies over 180 pounds, if you want to become unrecognizable by summer, we're launching a beginner-friendly Tai Chi walking program for women. With just 7 minutes,
are sent to our schools. And we would have the desired outcome of reducing sugar in the level of sugar that is consumed. I want to turn to the environmental levy. The name of the tax suggests that the cash flows from it will be directed towards environmental production, towards protecting our coastlines, our watersheds, our forests, the very natural infrastructure that Melissa reminded us we cannot afford to neglect. But the money goes straight into the consolidated fund. None of it is ring-fenced for specific environmental purposes. So we have a levy collecting money in the name of the environment, but it is not dedicated to the protection of the environment. It's simply another revenue source. And as with the sugary drinks tax,
Tai Chi walking is more than just a workout. It's a fresh start for menopausal women. We start this Monday.
ladies over 180 pounds, if you want to become unrecognizable by summer, we're launching a beginner-friendly Tai Chi walking program for women. With just 7 minutes a day, you'll safely firm your body, calm your mind, and start burning stubborn belly fat. In 1 week,
because the costs are going to drive up prices in the economy, and the burden is going to be felt by those who can least afford it. In examining the package that was tabled by the government, what I only can come to a conclusion on is that they recognized there was a revenue gap and they had to find the easiest way to fill it. The measures are not calibrated to protect the most vulnerable. They are not designed around the specific circumstances of a post-hurricane economy. They are simply revenue measures which impact the poor the most. I want to turn to the digital services tax because the minister's presentation on Tuesday left us with more questions than answers. When this measure was first announced, the reasonable assumption shared by many persons was that the tax would apply to subscriptions, for example, Netflix, Spotify, those streaming and digital services. That was the natural reading of a digital services tax and what obtains in many other jurisdictions that have implemented it. But from what the minister said on Tuesday, it appears that the intention is different. It seems that the tax will apply to goods purchased online from platforms like Amazon, Temu, and Shein. Now, Madam Speaker, if that is indeed what is being proposed, then a serious question arises. Because that government 2 years ago made a very deliberate policy decision to raise the threshold on online purchases, increasing the custom duty exemption from 50 to 100 US and from $500 to $1,000 for persons traveling into the country. That was a conscious choice to reduce the cost burden to Jamaicans, and it was met with huge applause. Now, the digital services tax seems to be working against that relief. This inconsistency needs to be explained. You cannot, on the one hand, increase the threshold to give consumers a break, and then on the other hand, you take back what you have just extended. And so the minister said in her presentation that local retailers are feeling the pressure from online shopping. So the obvious question is, if that was the case, why then did the government 2 years ago increase the threshold to provide the relief? to now take it back from the very persons who you have provided relief. And beyond the inconsistency, there is the practical question of how this is going to be implemented. How are the taxes going to be collected? Who is going to be responsible for remitting it? What is the mechanism for enforcement across hundreds and thousands of transactions from foreign platforms? The minister owes the House an explanation. She has been here twice, and I must say, having spoken twice, it is as confusing as it was before. As to exactly so I expect the minister, when she comes in her closing, to give a clear and complete explanation of how the measure will actually work and how it will be implemented. Madam Speaker, I want to talk about the NHT and specifically about the 11.4 billion extraction from the NHT each year. The government has been extracting money from the NHT for over a decade. Yes, we acknowledge it was the PMP that introduced this measure in 2013. And I believe, absolutely, and I'm going to give you the context, because you spoke about the 20-year rows who you wanted to give a historic perspective in. But I notice whenever you talk about the economy, you don't want to talk about what happened between 2007 and 11. You conveniently leave that out. So when you were talking, you have added 15 minutes to my presentation because I am going to give the perspective and I'm going to give the context. When we came to office in 2012, we inherited an economy on the precipice of collapse. And before that, let us recall. Come on. Member from East Central, St. James. You know, I consider I'm a father, so you have to listen to me when I talk, all right? But before that, Madam Speaker, we need to recall that the economy experienced 14 consecutive quarters of negative growth between 2007 and 2010, only to achieve a mere 1.5% growth in 2011. In 2011, the JLP abandoned and effectively ended the 27-month standby agreement with the IMF. And when I say abandoned, you know, like how Tessa keep a school, and you're supposed to show up. Them run going at the yard and hide and never take the test. Because of how badly the JLP dealt with the IMF agreement, Jamaica was effectively shut out of the international capital markets. Our international financial partners had lost confidence in the country's financial management. We inherited that situation and had to renegotiate the IMF agreements from a position of considerable weakness. That agreement was one of the most demanding fiscal programs ever imposed on any country born from the fund. There was a primary surplus target set of 7% that Jamaica was 7.5% that Jamaica was required to maintain, which was among the highest ever demanded by an IMF agreement. In fact, it was higher than what was demanded of Greece during its own debt crisis. That is the mountain we were given to climb. The NHT withdrawal at that time was one part of a broader package of measures designed to meet that primary surplus requirement. It was not a decision taken lightly or casually. It was a hard choice made in extraordinary circumstances with the explicit understanding that it was temporary. No. The same reason that drove the NHT withdrawal in 2013 is the same reason that drove the broader package of revenue measures that had to be implemented at the time, including new taxes. We had no other choice but to impose taxes to get to the revenue that the IMF required as part of its program. It was, Madam Speaker, what they left us in 2011 that required us to take the steps that we had to in 2012. The hard choices, and I want to look at this chart, because the minister used it on Tuesday and said she wanted to explain to the 20-year rows, right? And so, yes, it is your chart, and I want to use it to explain to the 20-year rows why those taxes had to be imposed from 2012 to 2016, 2015. But I also, there's been this, I don't know if I can say lie, about no new tax for 10 years. We've been hearing this misrepresentation that there's been no new tax for 10 years. But then I looked on the minister's chart. So what is in 2016? What is in 2017? So, Damien, when you go back to Ty Dixon, I want you to ask your constituent, what can go so? Madam Speaker, the hard choices that we had to make have worked. The PMP established Jamaica's macroeconomic fundamentals under the leadership of then Prime Minister, the most honorable Portia Simpson Miller, and Minister of Finance, Dr. Peter Phillips. They restored the confidence of our international partners. They put this country back on a credible fiscal path. The economic stability that this government inherited, they benefited from what we built from 2012 to 2016. No, Madam Speaker, if we're going to have a history lesson, we must just do it honestly. We can't pretend that everything on this side has been great, but give the context. Don't come here and give a half story. Leave out your term from 27 to 2011, like never happened. That would just get up in 2012 and inherited some better roses. Give the proper context so that the same 20-year-olds we are talking to will know. Tell the people the truth.
The reduction of poverty, the reduction of unemployment. Let's go back to the 90s.
The internet. Madam Speaker, I need your protection.
Members.
Why not? Madam Speaker, The international community recognized what the PMP did during that period. The then IMF Managing Director, Christine Lagarde, and I quote, "I want to pay tribute to Minister Phillips and his colleagues for what has been a clear change of course, making the hard choices and successfully completing 4 reviews. We never run from it. We never go into the schoolyard and say we now take the test. We knew it was difficult. We faced it. We knew it was painful, but we knew it was in the best interest of the country to do so." So I now want to come back to the NHT withdrawal. And I want to remind the House of how the then JLP opposition responded. They didn't simply disagree with the measure, Madam Speaker. They campaigned against it loudly and relentlessly, framing it as an attack on the working class, framing it as an assault on the poor, framing it as a betrayal of the Jamaican people. The person who was the most vocal was the Prime Minister himself. Right? So I want to read what the Prime Minister said in 2015. All right? And this is not artificially, intelligently created. This is the real thing. And I quote, "The JLP does not support the use of NHT funds for purposes other than those for which they were intended. The NHT mandate is clear. Contributors' money held in trust at NHT is to be used for the purposes of the promotion of housing and community development. The JLP has always stood in the vanguard where stewardship of NHT funds are concerned. We are the ones who have always defended NHT and protected the interests of contributors, not the least of which are those thousands of Jamaicans who have been making contributions to the NHT and are yet to access a benefit." Dayton, where can I find that person? Madam Speaker, I'm going to star you more because more. The matter was taken to court.
By an affiliate.
They didn't go up front, but somebody went up front.
Yeah, man.
And they lost.
Yeah, they lost.
Now, Madam Speaker, after the JLP formed the government in 2016, you would have expected that NHT withdrawals would have ended based on how strident their position was. The so-called betrayal of the Jamaican people that they had fought against. But every year since, without interruption, 10 years of collecting the money, they once vehemently opposed. Now, recently I heard the Prime Minister, maybe last week, justifying the continued extraction by arguing that the funds are being directed to other national priorities.
Shameless.
So I want to ask the Prime Minister one question. When the PMP had to do it between 2013 and 2016, were we not also directing those funds to national priorities? Were we not also using that money to meet the primary surplus that kept Jamaica out of default? Were we not using it to restore the confidence of the very international partners whose support the government relies on today? What exactly was different? What principle was being violated? You have found your voice. You have found your voice now. I'm glad you found your voice now. I'm glad you found your voice now. Because I don't know which Andrew Holness are talking to, whether it's the one now or the one in 2015.
Do you think all dishwashing soaps are the same? Try Dawn and discover its grease cleaning power. Dawn removes
So what was different? What was different now than it was in 2013? The only thing that was different was you were on this side and we were on that side. Now, Madam Speaker, I want to turn.
No, listen, allow him to talk. Allow him to talk. Nobody's talking. All of them come here, you will listen. All of them come here, you will listen. All right, don't interrupt him. Do not interrupt him.
I never expected you to get so agitated. You're going to speak next week Thursday, no? And we will listen to you next week Thursday. And I don't intend to enumerate all the things over the last 10 years. You want me to? Okay, all right. Madam Speaker, I want to address something about the framing of this budget and how the revenue measures have been presented to the public. Yes, the country has suffered a major catastrophe through Hurricane Melissa, which has damaged the country and impacted the government revenues. But we need to look beyond that and go back to the last 2 years to see how the government has been balancing the budget. In the two previous consecutive years, the government securitized future revenues from the Norman Manley International Airport and the Donald Sangster Airport, raising over 70 billion in 23-24 and 60 billion in 24-25. What that meant is that they sold off 12 years in one case of future revenues and then 10 years of future revenues to ensure that they could fund the budget. And the analogy that I would use is like you go to your boss and you're under some pressure and you say, boss, give me a salary advance for the next 12 months. And you use the money for deal with the rent and all the other things. So when next month comes, you can't get another advance. So you have to go find something else. So this is next month. So having sold off the revenues of both airports, there is nothing more to sell to meet the recurrent expenditures. So, Madam Speaker, those securitizations provided upfront cash that supported the budget of the day. So what this tells you is that long before Melissa, there was always a challenge for tax revenues organically to meet the expenses of the government. And so the government relied on these one-off transactions to balance the budget, something which was raised by the fiscal commissioner and has been raised as a risk going forward. And we have raised it as well, and we did for the last 2 years. So the gap between what the government was collected and needed and what it was spending was widening. Those pressures existed before Melissa came.
Poor management.
Before Melissa came. And so it is important.
Poor management.
It is important that there is a context explained of the challenges that this government has faced, particularly around growth and tax revenues. Now, they have been aggravated by the hurricane and made worse, but they existed long before. And we are not minimizing the impact that the hurricane has had on the country and the economy. But the Jamaican people need a context and an honest explanation as to the fiscal challenges that existed and that they existed long before Melissa hit our shores. Now, Madam Speaker, I want to turn to what we would do differently. The government has looked at the revenue gap and has reached for the imposition of new taxes to fund the budget. And the continued drawdown of the NHT, what 11.4 billion. We have looked at a similar gap and we have determined an alternative way to fund the budget while balancing the lives of the Jamaican people. Madam Speaker, we have always said that compliance can bring in more revenues than simply raising new taxes. And I am recommending the implementation of an electronic invoicing system for the tax administration of Jamaica. The first source of this revenue would be this electronic invoicing system, which we estimate would generate an additional 8.6 billion in tax revenues. And I will explain how I came to that figure. Currently, and what this electronic invoicing does. So currently, when businesses make sales, they are required to upload their transaction records for verification by TAJ. The problem with the model is that the obligation to upload sits with the business, and there can be slippage. Not necessarily because businesses are deliberately evading the obligations, although that happens, but because it is a system where the seller is responsible for submitting the records. Transactions can go unrecorded, uploads can be incomplete, and there can be a gap between what was earned and what was reported. The electronic invoicing system changes that dynamic fundamentally. Rather than waiting for businesses to upload their records after the fact, the transaction data is captured and transmitted immediately to TAJ automatically at the point of sale. The government is no longer relying on voluntary compliance. The information flows directly and is matched automatically against what has been declared and remitted. The scope for under-collection shrinks considerably because the data is already there, verified and auditable, without the business having to do anything beyond completing the sale. We have looked at case studies in other parts of the world, in particular, the impact that electronic invoicing has had in Central and Latin America. In Mexico, where this has been implemented, declared revenues increased by 14% in the 3 years after the electronic invoicing system became mandatory. In Uruguay, VAT, which is the equivalent of our GCT, and corporate income tax collections rose by an estimated 3.7% when the system became compulsory. In Peru, taxable sales reported to the tax authority increased by 7% in the first year alone. Chile, which pioneered this model in Latin America, saw over 8 million electronic tax documents being processed monthly at the point of maturity, covering more than a quarter of all tax documents issued in the country. The pattern is consistent wherever this has been implemented. Better data means better compliance. And better compliance means more revenues from the same tax rates without asking anyone to pay more than what they owe. That's right. The experience in Chile and other countries that have followed a similar model demonstrates that the revenue gains from better compliance are achievable and that we in Jamaica have every reason to pursue this path. In the 26-27 fiscal year, the government is projecting GCT receipts of $318 billion and SCT, special consumption tax receipts, of $112 billion, a combined total of $430 billion in these indirect tax inflows. We are conservatively estimating that 2% of that total, and I'm saying conservative because I'm looking at the fiscal year 26-27, and accepting that you may have some growing pains with the implementation of the system. Although the case studies across the region point to much higher impact when it is implemented. So we're being conservative, that a 2% of the 430 would yield 8.6 billion. And that is money. This is not new taxes. This is money that the government is entitled to collect. I must tell you, Madam Speaker, about a month or so ago, I was particularly caught by a story in the media. The TAJ indicated that 11 used car dealers were brought to court and were found to have liabilities of $4 billion. 11 billion, not million. 11 used car dealers were brought to court and found to have liabilities of $4 billion. It indicates, Madam Speaker, that compliance with greater enforcement can fill the gap that we are looking to do so with new taxes. And we need to provide the tools and the technology to TAJ to give them the authority. And this only works when it is mandatory. So there may be legislative changes that are needed to ensure that we can collect the full gamut of taxes that are out there. Madam Speaker, the second revenue initiative we are proposing is the establishment of a digital nomad program. And I'll explain what that is. That is a special legal permit allowing remote workers, freelancers, and entrepreneurs to live and work in Jamaica while employed by a company or clients anywhere in the world. Every year, 4 million tourists visit Jamaica. We have the brand, we have the climate, we have the culture. And we also have the connectivity infrastructure that those remote workers are looking for. What we do not have as yet is a structured program that allows them to stay longer, to work from here and spend their money right here in Jamaica. So we have looked at the case studies across the region. Barbados started it. There are about 6 Caribbean countries that have implemented it. And we are proposing a fee of $2,000 for a 12-month period. And we have estimated of the 4 million tourists that we would be able to get 5,000 of these digital nomads coming to stay in Jamaica in the first year. That would generate in the fees alone approximately $1.5 billion. But the fees only tell part of the story. The real story is when they come here, when they stay here, the restaurants, the Airbnbs, the hotels, the villas, the concerts, the food that they spend. That is the impact. Barbados estimates that each digital nomad spends on average $55,000 when they're there in Barbados. Yes, 55,000 US, right? I wouldn't be as optimistic as that. But if I estimate that in Jamaica, an average 6-month stay could yield a spend of 25,000 US, which is about $4,000 a month. Jamaica could realize the economic benefit of 125 million US dollars or 19.5 billion Jamaican dollars. Wow. Now, we are late to the game. Barbados did it immediately after COVID and took first mover advantage. But we do have many advantages which other countries in the region don't have. And a structured program can yield significant benefits to the people of Jamaica. In Barbados, in the first 10 months alone, the program attracted 2,500 applicants. It contributed over $100 million US dollars in broader economic activity in that country. We have a lot more that we can offer. We just need to put in place the framework and promote Jamaica as a location for digital nomads. Madam Speaker, I want to look at where some of the other areas that we intend to get some revenues from. And there are some targeted transfers from some specific public bodies that we would look at. Public bodies that have demonstrated surplus capacity that will not have any negative direct impact on their operations. The government is projecting for this coming year to withdraw $9 billion from the Bank of Jamaica. We would take an additional $1 billion to bring the total to 10. Now, I want to make a distinction. This is not the NIR. These are surpluses that are generated from the profits of the BOJ. We also looked at other public bodies who have surpluses, and I looked at the FCJ with a net surplus of 3.14 billion and profits of 5.15. And we would do a transfer of $1 billion from there. So, Madam Speaker, some of these institutions have demonstrated with their performance these surpluses, which, if put to the central government, would not affect their core operations. Madam Speaker, I'm coming back to the NHT withdrawal. We have said so before, and we are committed to ending the annual extraction of $11.4 billion from the NHT. The NHT was established for one purpose: to provide affordable and sturdy housing solutions for Jamaicans, particularly for those at the low and middle ends of the income scale. In the wake of Hurricane Melissa, with hundreds of homes damaged and destroyed across the country, this mandate has never been more urgent. This is not the moment to be pulling money out of the financing of housing development. It actually is the moment that we need to be putting more in. And so for us, ending the extraction and giving the NHT the capacity to do what it was created to do. And this goes, Madam Speaker, beyond just the mandate. When you invest in housing at scale, the economic benefits extend well beyond just the house itself. Construction workers get employment. The hardware suppliers go and get orders. The truckers go and get work. Money begins to circulate within communities. And that circulation of money will trigger and help to deal with the recovery that the country needs. The economic multiplier post-disaster economy, it is one of the most effective, stimulative investments a government can make. So that 11.4 billion deployed through the NHT into housing construction does far more for this economy than when it is diverted into the general consolidated fund. So, Madam Speaker, we would end the NHT drawdown and ensure that the funds go to those who have been most affected by the hurricane and those Jamaicans who struggle, work hard, and cannot find a house to buy. We have also looked at the expenditure side of the budget, and we have identified one specific deferral that would save $2 billion. The Airports Authority is projected, and this is interesting to note, the Airports Authority is projected to receive a transfer of $13 billion from central government.
Have them strip out the revenue like this year.
Now remember, the AAJ, those were the same entities where the government sold the future revenues to fund the current budget. And now, those same entities are receiving significantly higher support from central government. 13 billion, a figure much higher than has ever existed in any point in time. And because the revenues have been taken from the AAJ is now dependent on central government. The AAJ had earmarked $2 billion for the construction of a new corporate head office. We are proposing a deferral of that expenditure to the next fiscal year. So I want to now explain the impact of what our alternatives would be on our fiscal targets. So when you add it up, Madam Speaker, our alternatives create a revenue gap of approximately 17, and I'll go through this chart with you. We are removing 18 billion in taxes. We are projecting income of 8.6, 1.2 from just the fees from the digital nomad program. We'll still be left with a deficit of just over 8 billion. We will cease the NHT withdrawals and the 2 transfers, which account for 2 billion. So we end up with a negative of 17 billion. I indicated a reduction in the transfer to the airport authority, which takes 2 billion away. So we would still have a net deficit of $15 billion. $15 billion. The additional borrowing, which we would fund from the issuance of treasury bills, and the interest expense for the fiscal year would increase by $0.94 billion. Right? The additional borrowing would raise our projected debt to GDP ratio to approximately 66.14%, up from the projected 65.7%, a difference of 0.44 of 1%. So, Madam Speaker, yes, there are hard choices, but in a hurricane where people are struggling and you have a choice, do you impose 18 billion taxes on people who are struggling, or you find a way to fund it, which does not impact your debt dynamics significantly? And we do so in a responsible way. It's important to note the government is already borrowing $247 billion. And we have shown our proposals vis-a-vis the JLP's proposals. And I'm going to go into the detail of that, right? But the difference is not significant or material. And then let's look at the difference.
No, listen, man, leave the man, make him talk. It's not your time. It's not your time. I love Junior, make him talk.
We're making better choice.
Next week is
For the current situation.
The only thing I would encourage you to do, don't talk for 5 hours again, all right? All right. Because last year you keep us for 5 hours, all right? Now, when we look at the impact of our proposals versus theirs, it moves our debt to GDP ratio by 0.44 of 1%. 0.44 of 1%. Now, Madam Speaker, we have to balance the books while balancing the lives of people. For the people in Darliston and Betheltown, they need a break on White House. For your people in Russia, they can't take no more taxes right now. Right? We have to ease the pressure for them. Madam Speaker, I now want to turn my attention to how the path ahead. Because the reality, we have had low growth for the last 10 years, notwithstanding the external shocks. And even when you recover from the current Hurricane Melissa, the government's own projections are for 1% growth after 2029. You know 1% growth cannot generate the tax revenues that we need to provide the services that the country needs. So improve our tax revenues, restore the base so that we don't have to impose taxes on people. The immediate priority has to be restoring Jamaica's productive capacity to at least the levels that existed before Hurricane Melissa. But that must be the floor, not the ceiling. Recovery must be the starting point, not the destination. And any government that presents recovery as an achievement in itself is setting an unacceptably low bar for what the country can and should become. As I said, when you look at the government's own fiscal policy paper, after the recovery period of around growth up to 2029, the economy settles back down to 1%. The numbers are right there. So, Madam Speaker, what will we do differently to ensure that we can achieve growth? And I first want to start with the issue of energy. Because Jamaica, and I don't know whether we'll find oil or not, but there are some things within which we have control over. When we were last at the Wicked Philip, we had set a target of generating 50% of our energy from renewable sources. It was then, by 2030. We're nowhere near that. We're nowhere near that, not because of Melissa, not because of COVID, but quite frankly, just bad management on their part. When we issued in 2013 the request for a proposal, that led to a build out in 2016. It took that government 8 years to issue the next request for a proposal. 8 years. Persons were selected in 2024. It will take them 3 years or so, or more, because they have to look for the financing, they have to negotiate their private power purchase agreements, and they have to build out their infrastructure. So we're not going to see the impact of more renewables on the grid till probably 27 or 28. Now, we are faced with the prospect of oil prices of over $100 and going up. And while we can't control what takes place in the Middle East, we have control over what we can do here. And quite frankly, this government's record is poor. Energy costs in Jamaica are among the highest in the region and the world, averaging about US 40 cents per kilowatt hour. When we were last there, it was around 23 cents per kilowatt hour. What we would do, we would ensure that large customers, those in the special economic zones, can contract power directly from generators. Now, why is this important? We cannot attract manufacturers, assembly type operations with the high energy costs that we have. And so our prospects of economic growth will not materialize unless and it can be done quicker in those SEZs without changing any license. We would be separating dispatch, transmission, and distribution into a properly regulated structure with distinct licenses. We would disaggregate the electricity bills so that consumers can see what they're paying for, broken down into generation, transmission, distribution, system losses, and supply charges, because we believe transparency is important towards accountability. On renewables, we would scale up net billing, which you started, power wheeling. Yes, started by the member from East Kingston and Port Royal. You're going to claim that one too?
Them love a jacket for them. Oh, you love jackets, sir.
You love jacket, sir. You love jacket like wow.
So we would scale up net billing and power wheeling for distributed generation, expand solar technology for residential use, and introduce more flexible service and payment options so that the transition to cleaner, cheaper energy is accessible to ordinary Jamaicans and not just those who can afford the upfront costs. We would also ensure that vulnerable populations, including senior citizens, benefit from discounted rates, because the burden of high energy costs falls heavily on those who are least able to afford it. And we would tackle the issue of energy theft in a real concentrated way. You know, the issue, I don't know that there's a great appreciation for the impact that this has on the bills that every JPS customer pays. It adds 20%. But there's a perception that the people who are consumers and not customers just do it because them just want teeth light. It's not so. They can't get a meter from JPS if their house is not wired. And the cost of wiring a house and getting your meter passed by the government electrical inspector is beyond the reach of the majority of people who find themselves in that position. So even if they want to change their status, and my experience has been, many of them want to. Them don't want police to run them down and pull down them throats. But they simply can't afford to wire the house and to get the meter. And that requires more intervention from the government. Something has been done, but really what was started is insufficient.
Totally.
And if you don't deal with it, you can't address the high energy costs that the country faces. And so we would take a comprehensive approach to dealing with the issue of energy theft and giving options to persons who want to make the decision to move from being consumers to being customers of JPS. Madam Speaker, we cannot build a productive, high-growth economy on a workforce that has been underprepared. And the emphasis must be on the foundations, literacy and numeracy at the primary and basic school levels. Because if we fail there, the investment that is required further up the education ladder is significant to compensate for students who leave primary school and can't read and write. One of the biggest complaints that members of the private sector have said is that their greatest impediment right now to growth is that they can't find people to work. They can't find people to work. Of course I'm saying it. Yeah. But I don't come to the same conclusion you may have. All right. But every one of us in here as MPs can identify many persons in our constituency who are looking for work. So that mismatch between the needs of employers who say they need people, and then on the other hand, constituents who are within 18 to 65 looking for work continues to widen. But we have to close the gap. We have to close that gap. Because importation cannot be the answer to that solution. And so the investments that need to be made at the basic and primary level have to be stepped up so that every child who leaves a primary school can read and write, can do little maths, the 3 R's. Because if that foundation is created, we will have enhanced productivity and greater revenue growth and economic prosperity. But we also need to ensure that children who have special needs are included and resources provided so that they can function in the education system. There are too many, particularly boys, where the teacher them say, why the boy get so much trouble? And can't sit down at the class and listen. But they may be undiagnosed, right? They may be undiagnosed because the parents can't afford to get a private diagnosis, which costs $50,000 and up. If they register at MICA, which provides the service, is a 2-year waiting list. And so too many of our children who are not performing at the level that they need to are children who are undiagnosed. We need to ensure that we get to the root of that. So, Madam Speaker, if we're at the wicket, we would align education and training with industry needs in a deliberate and structured way, expanding technical and vocational training in the high demand sectors. Central to this is reforming heart. The institution has a
Make it a habit. 7 minutes of Tai Chi every morning, all the way for 1 month. In 1 week, you'll feel better. In 2 weeks, you look better. In 1 month, your wife won't believe your results. Here's a Tai Chi workout plan, made for men over 50. These beginner-friendly exercises take just 7 minutes.
Government matches the cost that a company spends on upskilling its workers through tax credits on their hard contribution. So if you are a business and you are willing to invest in ensuring that your employees are upgraded, you are already contributing to HART through the employer contribution. You will be getting a credit equivalent to what you are spending to upgrade your workforce. And we are doing that because we know Jamaica has a productivity problem. Our productivity continues to decline. And unless we attack the problem at the source by investing more in our workforce, we are going to continue to languish at the 1% growth rate, which has plagued this country for a long time. Madam Speaker, I want to look at growth without efficiency is not sustainable. And one of the clearest indictments of this government's management of the economy is the problem that you have faced in spending the capital budget. If we look at the last 3, and it may go back further, fiscal years, there has been significant underspend of the capital budget. Now, people might ask, why does that matter? Well, the greatest correlation between economic growth is how you spend your capital budget. So if you want to move beyond the 1%, you have to spend the capital budget. But year after year, the capital budget becomes underspent and reallocated to other sources. It's not a good thing. We have heard the issues of procurement. We have heard the issues of the public investment management system. We have also heard the issues that some of our contractors don't have the capacity to do the projects that we want them to do. But I would say to your Prime Minister, 10 years in, we must find a solution to this problem. And I want to say specifically to you, you have the right to organize the government the way you want as Prime Minister. But when I look at the capital budget for both central government and public bodies, 60 to 70% of the capital spend sits in 2 ministries, Ministry of Economic Growth and Infrastructure and the Office of the Prime Minister, which are headed by you. Now, you might say you want to facilitate that on your own, but then it must become a bottleneck. When all of those big agencies, from NHT, Port Authority, UDC, factories, as public bodies, and then central government, I'm urging you to rethink this, to look back at this structure. Because what you may have envisioned as making things flow quickly, it has not happened. And the evidence of it is the level of underspend of our capital budget. And if we're going to move the country forward, we have to unclog that bottleneck that is preventing those monies from being spent in the economy. The banking sector is another area where the efficiency of the broader economy can be improved, and is directly connected to whether the private sector can actually drive the growth that we need. I took note on Tuesday, Madam Speaker, the minister re-announced an announcement made by the Bank of Jamaica governor of the implementation of the eKYC system, which was done in 2024. I have no issue with that system. It is actually a good thing and will actually improve competition within the banking sector. But June 24 was when the announcement was made. And Fitz not here. I believe it was right here at a standing finance committee meeting that the BOJ governor said that, of the eKYC system. But I expected minister to go further than just eKYC. Because while that is a start in enhancing competition within the banking sector, there is more that needs to be done to make the sector competitive and to ensure that monetary policy can work. So the government, through its ministries, agencies, and departments, is the single largest holder of deposits within the banking sector. Those deposits, by and large, remain with the two largest banks. And the government has to implement a system that ensures that there's a more transparent and competitive way in which all banks can access government deposits. What exists right now reinforces the status quo. Now, I see the cannabis man nodding his head. Not that I know that you smoke it, but that you're an advocate for it. Right? But why is this important? We hear the BOJ governor complain every day. I reduce interest rates and the bank don't do nothing. The banks don't move. I take steps to bring down requirements, nothing happens. People in the public who have mortgages, car loans, see BOJ bring down them interest rates, no movement. And there will be no movement unless we can enhance competition within the banking sector. But the government can do some things. Putting in place a more effective system to deal with government deposits and the long-standing issue of addressing the asset tax. A commitment that was made on that side many years ago to remove it still exists. And so, if we want to unlock growth, if we want companies to be able to access funding at a reasonable rate, if we want businesses to expand, they must be able to access capital at reasonable rates. And so, while fiscal policy can work, the monetary policy is not, because the monetary transmission mechanism is clogged. And it is clogged because of the high concentration in the way the banking sector currently operates. The government can do more to facilitate competition in the sector, which will free resources that can go to economic growth and job creation. I want to turn to small and micro businesses. And there's a distinction that policy in this country has consistently failed to make. And it matters significantly and makes a difference. A person running a one-chair salon, a hairdresser or a stylist, faces a fundamentally different set of obstacles from a company with 50 employees. But they're all lumped under the category of MSMEs. They're all treated as MSMEs. And I said, the M and the S, the micro and the small, need particular attention. In most cases, they are informal, but they face a particular paradox. They can grow beyond a particular size while remaining informal, because there's no way they can get access to capital from a bank, from equity investors, from a loan company, unless their books are there. Nobody going to give them money unless they can provide audited financial statements. But they prefer to stay informal because they don't want to deal with TAJ. And that's just the reality. And so we have to find a way to incentivize particularly the M and the S to come into the formal system. And there are ways in which we can do that. We proposed a holiday where for new businesses, MSMEs, that once they file, which means they're coming into the formal system, they would not be required to pay taxes for the first 3 years of their operation. Now, you might say, I'm giving up revenue. But quite frankly, in the first 3 years, they don't really generate any profit. But the benefit you get is that you bring them into the formal system. They have to keep proper accounts. And so that they can access the capital markets to grow and build their businesses. And once they do that, when they get into the position where they have to pay taxes, they will be paying taxes at a much higher rate. But unless we can break that barrier of informality, we are restricting the growth that can exist in the country. And some more needs to be done to bring those entities, the micro and the small, into the formal. Madam Speaker, I want to address what the minister said about the MSMEs on Tuesday. She spoke about the set-aside provisions to ensure that a part of government's revenues would be set aside for the MSMEs. That was announced by that minister in 2019 and announced again in 2020. The former Minister of Finance. The former Minister of Finance. Madam Speaker, it has taken 7 years. Another announcement by the minister on the same thing. I don't know what has happened in the 7 years, but when I talk to people in the sector, them say nothing. But we have another big announcement made on Tuesday that those set-aside provisions will for procurement. So to be clear, we're talking about ensuring that government, who is the largest player in the economy, sets aside particular sums that MSMEs can participate in procurement. 7 years later, there has been no meaningful progress made on this. Now, when we talk about growth and the need to grow the economy, this is a low-hanging fruit that we can implement. If our MSMEs can participate more in government procurement, their businesses will grow. They will employ more people. They'll pay more GCT, more income tax. That's how you grow the economy. So there are things that are within the control of the government that the government can do to ensure that we facilitate growth. And I would say to you, Minister, the sector is looking for action here. No more talk, not a bag of mouth. Action here. They have waited patiently for 7 years, and they have not seen any movement. Madam Speaker, on the emerging sectors, Jamaica has genuine opportunities in digital services, agro-processing, logistics, the creative industries, and cannabis. And these are not abstract possibilities. These are real. The foundations already exist. What is missing is the deliberate policy support, access to capital, and the regulatory frameworks that will allow these sectors to move beyond potential to actual contribution. And again, if we are serious about growing the economy, these are the sectors that we need to give priority to. Underpinning this, Madam Speaker, is the question of exports, because Jamaica will never generate the kind of wealth its people deserve by simply selling to the 3 million of us here. We have to look outwards, and looking outwards is not just the diaspora, it is in many other countries, to grow the value of what we produce, to build industries that can compete on the world stage, and to ensure that more of the earnings from the industries stay in Jamaica and benefit Jamaican workers and communities. That is the direction our growth agenda points. And it is the direction that this country needs to be moving in with considerably more urgency than what we have been seeing from the government. Madam Speaker, Jamaica is at a critical point in its history. The hurricane has laid bare the vulnerabilities that were always there. The structural fiscal pressures that predated Melissa, the chronically low growth that has kept living standards stagnant for too long, the public institutions that were not ready when the moment demanded them, and the Jamaicans who, as always, carried more than their share of the burden while waiting on the government's response. The question is, the government's budget was supposed to answer what happens next. How does this country recover, and how does it grow in a way that actually changes people's lives? The budget that has been presented falls short in this regard. Falls short. It falls short for the woman in Sablamar who lost her shop and is hoping for some ease to the predicament that she faces so that she can send her children to school. It falls short for the man in Mobile whose car was destroyed in the hurricane and who wants to get his taxi business back up and running. It falls short for the man in Katadupa, the farmer, who we need to produce so that we can import less and we can supply our hotels. And it falls short for the NHT contributors whose monies continue to be diverted away from the institution it was meant to serve by a government that once opposed that very practice. Madam Speaker, I want to be clear about what this side of the House represents in this moment. We're not here simply to oppose. We are here because accountability is what democracy requires. And because the Jamaican people deserve a parliament that takes their responsibility seriously and discharges it honestly.
That's right.
So when we critique the government's budget, it is because the choices made in that document have real consequences for the people. And the people deserve to know that those of us on this side of the chamber are examining those choices carefully and offering a genuine alternative. Madam Speaker, Jamaica's best days are not behind us. They are ahead of us. If we are willing to make the choices that will get us there. We are not a small country with small ambition. We are a small island that has already shown the world what Jamaica is capable of. And we have barely scratched the surface of what we can become. Madam Speaker, we have presented an alternative to what the government has proposed. We have sought to balance the lives of the people while balancing the books. We have looked at the impact of this hurricane and the devastation it has had on so many Jamaicans. And we believe that the path forward of growing the economy is the only sustainable way that we can lift the living standards for all Jamaican people. Thank you very much, Madam.
House Leader.
Madam Speaker, we thank the member for his spirited contribution. We will continue the budget debate next Tuesday, where we will hear from the leader of the opposition. And And then to remind the House that we return on the 19th of March, where we will hear from the Prime Minister. 24th, where we will hear from, yes, the 19th, where we will hear from the Prime Minister. That's what we are. So, Madam Speaker, it's not intended for us to do any further business today. I ask that the House be adjourned for a date, for Tuesday the 17th of March 2026.
The question is that the House do now adjourn to Tuesday, March 17th, 2026. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. This honorable House now stands adjourned.